Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. It's a vivid picture that we have in Genesis chapter 2. The earth has been created, the heavens have been created, and God is waiting. There are no plants, there are no trees, there are no herbs of the field. And why? Because God has not yet created a creature who can care for those plants, for those trees, for those herbs. So God is waiting. And then God creates an earth creature. And that's actually a better translation of the Hebrew than saying that God has created man, because the word in Hebrew is Adam. And Adam is a word that is undifferentiated when it comes to gender. It just means an earth creature from the earth. Adam from Adama. Adama is earth. So we are all earth creature from the earth. God creates that earth creature. And what's interesting is which the account happens. Usually, we tell a story where human beings are kind of the pinnacle of creation, where human beings live with all of creation as the stage. All those trees and plants and animals, they're just the backdrop for human history. But that's not how this story goes. That's actually the myth of human progress, not the biblical story. The biblical story is one where God sees the needs of plants first and creates the earth creature to meet those needs. The needs of plants to have someone to till them, to tend them. Actually, the Hebrew word has more the sense of to serve them. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm contradicting the children's message, which said that we are special. We are. Human beings are not only the earth creatures to serve the earth, but we are also created in the image of God. And that means we need to ask ourselves, what does God do? What is this image that we are to be like? And again, our clue comes from this story. God begins by being attentive to the needs of creation. That's how the story begins. So at the very least, if we are image bearers, we should be attentive to the needs of creation. But then God gets down in the soil, in the dirt. This is a God with dirt under God's fingernails. And God carefully and painstakingly crafts a human being, an earth creature, out of that soil. And then God leans down and breathes the breath of life into us. So God is the artist, the potter, the one who brings life for creation. And then, of course, God plants that garden. God puts trees in the garden that are good for food and beautiful to look at. God creates the plants for all of us to eat. And when we get to the Psalms, we'll see plants for animals to eat as well. God is the one who is the first gardener. And so, if we are to image God, somehow this means that we also have dirt under our fingernails, that we are also out there working in the garden for the flourishing of creation. And I should say that this word for garden, it isn't so much a sense of a nicely cultivated garden like you'd find around a historic home, or even a cottage garden, or even a vegetable garden. This garden that God plants is more like a food forest, more like this land, this traditional territories that we acknowledge this morning, more like these lands were before contact, when indigenous peoples tended and kept them. So this is what God does. And if we image this God, then we are also the ones who are attentive to creation. who, as it says in verse 15, the ones who are called to tend and keep, or better in the Hebrew would be to serve and observe. That's our calling, to serve and observe creation just as God serves and observes creation in Genesis chapter 2. And interestingly enough, our psalm just reinforces this picture of why the earth was created and why we have been created to be on the earth. The psalmist says that grasses were created for the flocks and the herds, and plants also for human consumption. And what this means is there are actually plants that are meant for cattle, for flocks and herds, that are not meant for us. There are different plants that are meant for us. And the psalm goes on in some of the verses that we didn't read this morning. If you can look them up later if you want, because Psalm 104 is a beautiful, beautiful psalm to just meditate on. God created the mountains for the goats, and God created the trees for the storks, or perhaps we might say God created the silver maples for the orioles. God created the rocks for the rock badgers, or we might say for the snakes and the skinks. These are parts of creation that are not primarily for human use. They are for the use of other creatures. So when human beings decide to cut down all the trees to put in a housing development, or we decide to take the top off mountains for our coal, or we decide to bulldoze the rocks out of our way so that we can put in a road or put in our crops, we are actually destroying what God has intended to be the homes of other creatures. God has intended different kinds of homes for us. But God meant for the mountains and the rocks and the trees to be home, that other creatures might flourish, that other creatures might find safety. And it isn't just actually places that God intends for other creatures. Time is also intended for other creatures. So further on in the psalm, God says, or the psalmist says, at night, the animals come out to hunt in safety. The lion comes out to find its prey. So maybe it's not safe for the animals that the lion is hunting, but for the lions, it's safe because the human beings have gone to their rest. And when the sun comes up, those animals go to their rest, and human beings go about their labor until sunset. So what happens when we colonize not only the places of other animals, other creatures, but what happens when we colonize the night? When our sounds and lights take over the oceans and the swamps and the forests? Well, we know what happens, don't we? The sea turtles can no longer find their way to the ocean. The fireflies can no longer mate. The bats can no longer hear their prey. When we colonize the night, we make it impossible for other creatures to flourish. This psalm makes it very clear that when we overstep our boundaries, when we colonize the spaces of other animals, when we colonize the time of other creatures and other animals, that we are acting in greedy and unjust ways. And interestingly enough, the psalm ends by saying that the wicked will be taken away from the earth and they will be no more. And why will they be taken away? Because they are no longer behaving as the earth creatures. And when we no longer behave as the earth creatures should, then we lose the privilege of being the earth creatures. Now, this is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and it's kind of a bittersweet anniversary. Normally, anniversaries are celebrated to celebrate faithfulness, right? Like when my parents celebrated their 50th anniversary of marriage, we were celebrating 50 years of faithfulness, or 50 years of a business in the community. That's 50 years of faithful service in the community. But as we come up to the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, we realize that we haven't actually been very good at being faithful to our calling as earth creatures. We haven't been the ones who have respected other creatures and their places. We haven't respected their time. We haven't been careful about serving and observing the needs of creation. We haven't, in the end, been very good at being the image bearers of a God who serves and cares for creation. We haven't thought it that important to actually have dirt under our fingernails. Gee, as I glanced down, I realized I actually have dirt under my fingernails. Not because I haven't been washing my hands, but I live on a farm, and sometimes it's hard to get rid of that. We haven't remembered the importance of our role as earth creatures. And of course, now we are reaping the results of our actions. The seas are rising, insects are dying, birds are in decline. And the bacteria and viruses that used to live in the wild are now colonizing our bodies. You see, the Bible's pretty clear. When human beings don't give creation the Sabbath that creation needs, creation will take Sabbath of its own accord. And whenever creation takes the Sabbath that it needs, whenever creation does that by force, human beings suffer. And so, we are suffering. Creation is forcing us to stop. Creation is forcing us to give it a rest. And as a result, we are suffering as though we are in exile in our own land. And what's interesting to me, or even slightly ironic, is creation is taking this Sabbath on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. In the Bible, the 50th year was the year of Jubilee, when creation was supposed to be granted a rest, when slaves were set free, when prisoners to debt were set free, and people were to return to their own land. Does this sound at all familiar? Creation is this year forcing Sabbath on us. Animals are returning to the canals, to the cities. People in cities can hear birdsong once again. Lions are lying on the roads in Africa. Creation is moving into the spaces that we have pushed it out of. But other Jubilee things are happening as well. Prisoners are actually being released. And the government is freeing up money for those who need. There are some people who were doing minimum wage jobs, barely able to pay their rent in Toronto, who are now able to eat well because they are receiving funds from the government now that their jobs have closed. It's as if creation has forced Jubilee on us, forced rest on us. And the real question is, what will happen when this moment of pause ends? When this Jubilee reset is over, what will actually happen? Will we use the Sabbath time that has been given to us to recall our role as earth creatures? Will we use this time to remember what it means to serve and observe the creation? Will we remember what it means to bring life instead of death to creation? Will we remember what it means to image a God with dirt under our fingernails? We need to acknowledge we're living through a time of immense grief and sorrow. The loss of life, the loss of physical contact with each other, the loss of jobs and our security. We aren't that different from the disciples who lived through Holy Week and saw their whole world collapse, everything they had hoped for. But we also aren't that different from the disciples because we know that this is exactly where God works most often. It is always when we are at the darkest moment that God steps in to bring new life. Again and again in our story, this is how God works. And we just saw this most dramatically in Jesus' resurrection from the dead. We know that we serve a God who brings good new life in the midst of violence and darkness and despair. So our question is this: where do we see resurrection for ourselves and for the earth in the midst of this crisis? Where will we see new life happening? Where will we, as the image bearers, make this new life happen? You see, Jesus was resurrected as the earth creature. I notice your communion table says, and he was made man. And in the Hebrew, that would be, and he was made an earth creature, right? And when Jesus was resurrected, he was resurrected as an earth creature. And I think any hope that we have will only be found when we begin once again to also live as the earth creatures we were created to be.